Today we will hear from Dr. Michael McMullen, and his presentation is called Interfaith Comparisons, 20 Years of Data from Faith Communities Today Survey. And this particular piece of information only gives you a little bit of what he's been doing. He's been collecting the Baha'i data for faith communities today since the late 1990s. This is something that he and I have both been actually collaborating on. I've been helping out at the National Center, and he's been doing the sociological work and the actual survey work. And we've both been participating in the Faith Communities Today meetings, meeting annually. This particular comparative research project surveys members of groups as far-ranging as Baha'is, Baptists, Mormons, Muslims, and Methodists, and many others. They're actually now beginning to figure out how to collect data on Hindus and Buddhists as well. And this project is based at Hartford Seminary in Connecticut at the Hartford Institute for Religious Research. When Mike is not doing that, he's also professor of sociology at the University of Houston in Clear Lake, Texas, outside Houston. And he's been department chairman, which must have been keeping him quite busy. Based on the office behind him, you can see he has been definitely quite busy in his various research projects over the last 20 or so years. So I will now turn everything over to Mike so we can hear him. Welcome, Mike, to this webinar today. We're really grateful for your presentation.
Thank you, Rob, and thank you, Wilmette Institute, for inviting me to give this talk. As Rob said, we've been at this for a while. So let me say a little bit about FACT, or Faith Communities Today research project. This is probably the longest running interfaith survey of religious congregations in the US and probably in the world. This started in the late 90s as we geared up for the first major survey, which was in the year 2000, but we've had surveys in 2000, 2005, 2008, 2010, 2015, and then just most recently the last year in 2020. And the project is headquartered at the Hartford Seminary in Hartford, Connecticut. And it was initially funded by a grant by the Lilly Foundation. But since then, we've basically formed a nonprofit organization that is self-funding. There has been and continues to be lots of different denominations and faith groups that participate, and that's another reason why we think it's an important project, because it's not just a few Christian groups or a few other faith communities. That it represents at least 90% of worshipers in the United States. 41 denominations and faith communities are part of it. And the most recent survey had nearly 20,000 congregations involved. So this was what we call a key informant survey. So we're not surveying people in the churches or synagogues or temples or mosques. We're asking a key informant at each congregation or community to fill out the survey. And so for many churches, that might be the pastor or priest or a church secretary. For the Baha'i community, we sent the survey to local spiritual assembly secretaries. So for the most part, the data that we have for the last 20 years is from LSA secretaries. So most of what I'll talk about today will be an overview of the most recent FACT survey from the Baha'i community. So it'll focus on 2020. I'll also make some comparisons to previous surveys that have been done as part of FACT, and also to the wider society. So mostly churches, but also synagogues and mosques, just to kind of give us a sense of how do Baha'is compare to other communities in the US, other religious communities. There are about 350,000 churches, temples, synagogues, and mosques in the United States. So there's lots of examples of religious communities. The most recent Baha'i data collection, we sent out the survey to about 950 local spiritual assembly secretaries and got a response rate of 404, which was a little over 42%. which for an online survey is considered pretty good. Baha'is did much better than most groups, not as good as a couple. So we feel our data is pretty good. We did this as an online survey. We sent out a Qualtrics link if you're familiar with some online survey tools. And then I sent a couple different reminders. We collected data in January and February of last year, of 2020. So it was before the pandemic and some of the shutdowns in our society. Some religious groups didn't start collecting data till May or June. So they actually inserted some questions about how churches were responding to the pandemic. Unfortunately, we didn't have some of those. So I'm going to cover several things, some in more detail, some less. And please, if you have questions as we go through, keep track of those. And Rob said there'll be some time at the end to do question and answer. But these are major areas of the survey that are not only asked of the Baha'is, but also all the Christian groups, the Hindus, the Jews, the Muslims, etc. So we ask questions about worship, about leadership, about participants or members of the religious community, about the religious congregation's mission and identity, about various programs that they have in the church and for the wider society, and then about finance. And then over the years, since the first survey was in 2000, we've had special modules about technology used in churches, temples, synagogues, and mosques, about youth participation, about conflict in the religious group, about security concerns, and then about interfaith activity. And I'll touch on some of those if time allows. So the first area of the survey that I want to talk about is worship. So we asked, one of the questions was, when was the community founded, or when was the church built, if it was to the Christian community. And the average date of founding of Baha'i communities was 1971. So the average Baha'i LSA is about 50 years old. We asked about attendance at worship, and for most of the United States, this was a Friday, Saturday, or Sunday regular worship attendance. But of course, for Baha'is, our worship usually happens at the 19-day feast. So we had to modify the survey somewhat to accommodate the unique calendar of the Baha'i faith. But we asked about regular attendance at the 19-day feast. And as you can see, when we asked about 2020 worship, about 18 participants on average attended feast. We asked about a year ago, 17 was reported, 17 5 years ago. And then if you look at the data that we've collected over the years, the Baha'i faith has been remarkably consistent. About 17, maybe 18 is the average feast attendance. Now, what is interesting about this is it's kind of small compared to lots of other groups. The typical church has about 50 members, and maybe 30 to 40 attend in a typical week. So for Baha'is, it's about 17 on average for feast attendance. But what's remarkable here is that has been very consistent. And although we haven't grown in feast attendance over the years, we also haven't declined. And when you compare it to church attendance over the last 20 years, there's been a dramatic decline in church attendance throughout the United States. So the Baha'is have been, that's a positive thing that Baha'is have remained constant. We haven't grown, but we haven't also seen the decline that many religious groups have in the United States. We also asked about worship and what people feel about the main worship experience, in this case, the 19-day feast. And I'll call attention to just a few numbers here. There's a lot of data there. But Baha'is look very similar to other religious groups, to other churches, temples, synagogues, and mosques. Most people feel that their religious worship is contemporary and reverent and innovative. There were questions asked, you might think it's odd, about, for example, does your worship include electric guitar? And that was, as you can see, very few Baha'is include electric guitar or an organ or live music at all at their 19-day feasts. But this is mostly because in many churches, that's considered a marker of, if you have electric guitar or drums, you probably have a very contemporary worship service. And what the research has found, that the only churches that are growing in the United States all have a contemporary worship service, which is what draws in some of the younger members of the church. If a church does not have a contemporary worship, they are most likely declining severely in numbers. There was also the question, I thought, one thing that was interesting was that the last part of this slide talks about prayers or readings in another language. And the majority of Baha'i communities say that describes well or very well their 19-day feast. And that is much higher than most other religious worship experience in the United States. Baha'is tend to be much more multi-language. The typical church that has maybe, for example, a Catholic parish that might have significant Hispanic population, they're most likely to have an English service and then later in the day a Spanish service. But Baha'is have some certainly Spanish interwoven within for prayers, oftentimes in Persian as well. So our worship tends to be much more international, I guess you could say. We asked how many times in the past year a community has held feast, and 85% of Baha'i communities, this was from the 2010 survey, said they had all 19 feasts in a year. There's in the Baha'i calendar, feast is held once every month, and there's 19 months. 14%, another 14% had almost all their feasts, 12 to 18 times per year. So most Baha'i communities are active in holding regular worship. We also asked if the style of worship has changed. In 2010 survey, we asked this. The median was that the style had changed a little. 33% said that had happened. 41% said that they hadn't changed their style of feast at all. And what we found was that the change that was most likely to happen to reflect that percentage was they added more music, maybe some dramatic elements, or they added youth participation in feast. So Baha'i feasts are pretty stable. There's been a little bit of change, and a lot of this question was asked in order to try to capture have churches moved to dramatically increase the number of the contemporary worship service. And a lot of churches have tried to do that in the last 20 years to try to grow, as we said before. The next section asks about leadership, and of course the Baha'i survey had to be changed quite a bit because we do not have clergy in the Baha'i faith. So most of the surveys asked about the priest, the pastor, the imam, the rabbi. Instead, on the Baha'i survey, we asked about the local spiritual assembly. And so what we found from the 2020 survey, on average, the LSA, which has 9 participants, 9 members, on average, the median response was 5 of those 9 were women, 4 were men. In the age distribution, tended to be older Baha'is who were on the LSA. At least 4 were 60 or more, and 2, the median response was between 45 and almost 60 years old. So we tend to have fewer young people on the LSA, and older Baha'is tend to be on the LSA. We also asked about education. And as you can see, 4, 5, 6, 7 of the 9 members have a bachelor's degree or higher level of education on average. Those are median reports. So the Baha'i community in general is quite well educated, and that's also reflected in who gets elected to the LSA. The vast majority of the LSA have bachelor's degrees or higher levels of education. And then when we asked about race or ethnicity, there's some mix of racial and ethnic groups on the LSA. The majority are whites or Anglos, 5 out of the 9. But then there is a significant presence of minority membership on the LSA, but it's still majority white. We also asked how many times does your LSA meet in the last year. We asked this on the 2010 survey. The average was 17.1 times per year. So kind of surprisingly, the most LSAs meet once every Baha'i month. So I thought that was interesting. We asked how many of your LSA members were on the assembly 5 years ago, because there's been some critique in the literature about there's very little turnover on the LSA, but it turns out there is significant turnover. 3 to 4 members are new from 5 years ago on average. And then we asked about how many times in the last year did your LSA meet with an auxiliary board member or an assistant. And back in 2010, the answers were usually about 1 time, a little over 1 time on average per year. We didn't ask that in the 2020 survey. We had to make some decisions about how long the survey should be. My guess would be that it has increased, but hopefully in the next survey we can ask that question and find out. Then in the 2010 survey, we also asked about committee assignments on the LSA, that the LSA creates. And as you can see, assigning Ruhi tutors or recruiting Ruhi tutors, 75% of the LSA communities or the local communities had done that. Over half, or 53%, had a feast and holy day committee. 44% had a publicity committee, and then some other committees were also scattered throughout that. So the third section of the survey asked about participants. So we asked about how many people regularly participate in worship or other religious activities in your community. And the average was 31, the median was 15. So about on average 31 people participate in a local community. That could be Baha'is and non-Baha'is. We asked about of the regular participants, how many fall into the following age groups. And again, Baha'is are aging, you could say. The average age of the Baha'i community, I didn't report it here, was around 44, and that has crept up over the last 20 years that we've been collecting data. So the fact that the average age is getting higher means we need to do a better job of recruiting young people or keeping our young people. We'll talk more about that in a little bit. And one of the most fascinating parts of the fact survey has to do with the racial and ethnic diversity of Baha'i communities. And what this slide is telling us is that in the research on churches that's been done in the last 20 years, they have found that only about 5% of churches in the United States, remember there's about 350,000 religious communities in the United States, only about 5% are considered multiracial. And what that means from a sociological point of view is that at least 20% of the membership is from the non-majority racial or ethnic group. So it could be a mostly white church, but if at least 20% of the membership is African American, for example, that would be considered a multiracial church. Or if it's a mostly black church, but you have 20% membership that is Hispanic, that would be considered a multiracial church. So only about 5% of churches are multiracial in the U.S. And it makes me think of Martin Luther King's famous phrase that the 11 o'clock on Sunday morning is the most segregated hour in Christian America, because we still tend to have people worship in racially segregated communities. Now that's changing, especially mega churches that have started to sprout up. But the research shows only about 5% of churches are multiracial. That's different from the 53% of Baha'i communities that are multiracial. And the 2020 data also found about the same. That was the 2020 data. The 2010 data shows a very similar percentage. The Baha'i faith is the most racially and ethnically diverse religious community in the United States. Over half of our communities are considered multiracial based on this definition. So our emphasis on racial unity and the oneness of mankind seems to be borne out in a lot of the data that we collected here for fact. Just another couple of things that to note here. Let's see. Again, college graduates, about 38% of the membership of the regular participants are college graduates. That's higher than the average in the United States. So we tend to be a religious community that has higher levels of education. You see the poverty level, 3.7%. We tend to be above the national norm on income level as well. When we asked about lifelong members of the Baha'i community, about 30% said that they had been Baha'is for their whole life. And that squares with data that's been collected from other surveys. About 70% of the Baha'i community in the United States are converts. And only about 30% have been lifelong Baha'is or have parents who were Baha'is. So that's a little bit of a picture of the participants. The fourth section of the survey asked about mission and identity. And as you can see from the data here, most Baha'i communities feel they have a clear mission and purpose. They're striving for racial diversity. They are good at incorporating new people into the community. They're spiritually vital and alive. And this looks very similar to what most other religious communities report. Most churches, synagogues, and mosques also report that their membership feels strongly about their identity, that it has a clear mission and purpose. They're spiritually alive and vital. So we don't look too differently from most churches and synagogues. This question was less relevant to Baha'is, but I threw it in just as an example of some of the questions that appeared on the survey to reflect the fact that it's going out to a majority Christian audience. The question was asked on the 2020 survey: has your community experienced any of the following? Have you merged with another community, split into two or more, helped start a new community, or do church plantings, as they're called? As you can see, the vast majority of Baha'is have not participated in that. But what we're seeing in churches is that there's a lot of turmoil in the religious landscape in the United States because of declining participation. There's lots of mergers happening between churches. Some churches, especially mega churches, are splitting and establishing new plants or new campuses. So the religious landscape is really changing over the last 20 years. We did ask about having neighborhood feasts as some Baha'i communities grow, and over 82% of Baha'i communities still do not have neighborhood feasts to reflect the growing size and geographic spread of the community. Most have one feast in their municipal district. This is also a question that was geared mostly toward the Christian majority of FACT participants, but we asked about theological outlook of the majority of your church, synagogue, temple, or mosque members. And what we have found over the last 40 years in the United States is that churches are becoming more and more polarized, either very liberal in their theology and political orientation, or much more conservative in their theology and political orientation. And what I thought was interesting about the Baha'is here is that the vast majority said that they are moderate, and that there's a little bit of a bell curve to the data here. There's a few very liberal and a few very conservative majority Baha'i communities, but the most are right in the middle. So that I thought that was an interesting, I think, reflection of Baha'i efforts to not be involved in partisan or polarized politics, and you can see that in the reporting of the data there. We did ask some political questions on the 2020 survey, in part because for a lot of the people constructing the survey, we were thinking that it was going to be a partisan election, as we did see in this past year. And so we asked about, in the last 12 months, has your church or religious community organized any groups, meetings, classes, or events specifically focused on the following purposes: to discuss politics, to get people to register to vote, to get out the vote during an election, to lobby officials, to demonstrate, to distribute voter guides. As you can see, 95% plus, in most cases, of Baha'i communities did not get involved in any of that, again reflecting the effort by Baha'is to be nonpartisan and to not be involved in current political politics. That isn't to say we're not involved in issues of the day, but to not get involved with some of the political debates of the day. It's very different in churches. Churches are becoming more and more, again, as I said, polarized, either liberal or conservative. And so there's a lot more percentage of churches that say yes to this question. Baha'is, for the most part, do not do that. I'll probably skip over this in the interest of time. Also, some questions about politics. For the most part, Baha'is, again, are trying to be not involved in that kind of partisan activity. The fifth section of the survey was looking at programs. So what does your congregation or religious community do in the community? And as you can see, for a lot of these activities, Baha'is are not involved, or are not very involved at all. For example, social justice and advocacy groups, preschools, elementary or high schools, special needs ministries, etc. Where we do have a lot of emphasis is prayer and meditation groups. Not surprising, given the emphasis on devotionals. We also have an emphasis on community service activities. I think that's reflected in some of the Ruhi study circles and other service projects that come out of the Ruhi courses. So Baha'is are selectively active in the kinds of programs they provide, less so emphasizing social services, and more so emphasizing, I think, educational programs and prayer and meditation. And we asked specifically on the Baha'i survey about some aspects of the core activities. And as you can see, the vast majority of Baha'i communities say that there is some emphasis or a lot of emphasis on deepenings, devotionals, children's classes, junior youth classes, and Ruhi study circles. Over 90% of Baha'i communities are involved in study circles to some degree. Over 80% or almost 80% are involved in deepenings, and 96-97% are involved in devotionals. So Baha'i communities seem to be following the guidance of the National Assembly and the Universal House of Justice in engaging in these core groups. Another set of questions asked about emphasis given for family religious practices, and not surprising, Baha'is give a lot of emphasis to personal prayer and meditation, to fasting during the month of fast, to the daily obligatory prayers, to teaching the faith. And in some ways, the Baha'is don't look so different from other religious communities, churches and temples and synagogues that also give emphasis to these kind of family practices. So Baha'is aren't so different from a lot of those groups. We asked about to what extent are members of your community involved in teaching, and as you can see, the number that said quite a bit and a lot has declined a little bit over the last 10 years. I've had many conversations with Rob Stockman about the emphasis on Ruhi seems to have dampened a little bit of teaching efforts, although they do go hand in hand. But there does seem to be a little bit of decline in active teaching, although you could argue that Ruhi can be part of teaching if you have non-Baha'is involved. But there's still a lot of teaching activity happening, according to this data. I threw this in from 2010, the 2010 survey, just to kind of give a comparison. As I said before, the Baha'i community, maybe because of its size, maybe because of our emphasis in the last several 5-year plans on the Ruhi study circles and the core efforts that have been emphasized. Baha'is don't do a whole lot of providing social services like food pantries, daycares, health education and clinics, and so forth. A lot of churches provide those kinds of social services. Baha'is are less inclined to do so, although we participate with others that do that kind of thing. But our efforts tend to be more educational, more focused maybe on literacy, more focused on prayer meetings and spiritual education. And this question was asked in 2010 as well about have you had events or special events or programs in the community to publicize the faith or teach the faith. Again, as you can see, lots of Baha'i communities are active in that, but only about a third never do any kind of public events. I'm going to skip over a little bit of the finances. I do want to, the one slide I want to focus on, we asked a series of questions about are things better off financially or worse off? For the most part, Baha'i communities are relatively stable. But when asked about basically a community's budget, in 2020, the average budget was about $12,466. That's declined from the 2010 budget of $18,016. And so I don't know if that's reflecting, that's probably not reflecting the pandemic, because the 2020 data was collected before some of the shutdown and economic hardship. But just I think the growing economic difficulties in our country reflect maybe smaller budgets for Baha'i communities. I'm not sure. But finances are a little bit tighter than they were on average. So in the time I have left, or not a lot of time left, there's several special modules that I could talk about. Let me say a little bit about technology. In the 2020 survey, we asked, do Baha'i communities use the following technology? Almost all Baha'i communities, as you can see, use email. Most, a little over half, have a website, but not all. Most do electronic or online giving. But then when it gets to Instagram and Twitter and podcasts and some of those things, Baha'is are much less active. Churches have been taking on, again, growing churches not only have contemporary worship services, but then also post podcasts of sermons and that kind of thing to try to attract a younger audience or a millennial audience. Baha'is are not as active in that kind of thing. When asked about video projection, that's another sign of a contemporary worship service among churches. More and more Baha'is are doing that, using video projection or Wi-Fi access during feasts. And again, we asked about online meetings. Less than half said back in February of 2020 that they have those kinds of things. I would imagine that has changed dramatically since the pandemic has set in. Our technology profile hasn't changed a whole lot. A lot of people use email, about less than half use websites. Facebook was used much more in 2010. It's used much less now. So some of the technology has been changing among Baha'i communities. Let me just say a little bit about youth and young adults. I know I'm about out of time here, but back in, I think it was the 2015 survey fact, had a special module about youth and young adults. And the reason we did that was because it turns out every religious community in the United States, Christians, Jews, Muslims, Baha'is, Mormons, Hindus, Buddhists, all are having a struggle keeping young children and young adults active in the religious community. You probably heard reports from like the Pew Research Trust out in Washington. The largest group of religious people in the United States are people who have no religion. And that is happening most among millennials. And so there's lots of concern among church leaders, mosque leaders, religious leaders in general about how are we going to keep the next generation. And Baha'is are struggling as well as other religious communities, although we're doing a little bit better than others. Excuse me. So we are more likely to have children and youth participate in feast. Although in 2015, it was found that nearly 60% have no programs for young adults that are singled out to target young adults. So Baha'is could do better in terms of programming or trying to activate young adults. We do have some emphasis for youth. The junior youth program is one example of that. And so Baha'is look a little bit better than other religious groups in the U.S. because we have a junior youth emphasis. Again, how high a priority is it to engage young adults? The median response was it's a priority, but others are more immediate. And about 30% said it's not a priority. So more could be done there. I'm going to skip over some of these things. This was the thing that I thought was most interesting. Among young adults, we asked about attendance at 19-day feasts and in programs or activities other than worship. Excuse me. And we have about 48% and 45 or 46% on average of the young adults participate in those kinds of activities. This is much higher than most churches. Churches are struggling a great deal to keep young adults involved, and so their participation rates are around 20 or 25%. We are approaching about half. So we're doing a little bit better in that, maybe trying to get young adults involved in the Ruhi courses may be part of the reason for that. The last thing I'm gonna skip through some more of this. we can talk about it more at some other point. I wanted to mention Interfaith. So we asked about, in the past 12 months in the 2020 survey, has your community been involved in any of the following activities with other faith groups? Then we asked about with other Baha'i communities, and for the churches, it was with other churches, and then with other faith traditions, and then outside Christianity would be the parallel there. And Baha'is are much more likely, it turns out, to participate in interfaith worship and community activities. So Baha'i communities that said yes, they engage in worship services with other faith traditions. Almost 19% said yes. With educational or social activities, almost 30% said yes. And then community service activities. This includes Ruhi and some of the service activities, service efforts that come after the Ruhi courses, over a third. And this is much higher than most churches would find. Most churches are focusing on what's happening within their own membership, and there's been a decline over the last 20 years of kind of interfaith activity with other groups. But Baha'is, again, possibly because our religious scriptures talk about the unity of religion, Baha'is are much more active in those kinds of things. I think I will leave it there. I just have a few more slides left, but I think I'll leave it there in the interest of time, and let Rob kind of moderate any questions that people have.
Great. Thanks, Mike. This is fascinating data. I had seen some of it before, of course, and it's very exciting to see so much of it all at once and have it presented, especially comparatively with other religious traditions. We already have 6 in the Q&A and 6 in the chat.
Okay.
People have been raising their hands, and I would say don't raise your hand, because that's usually would be an opportunity for us to click to activate your camera and microphone, but we don't do that. So post things in the Q&A or post things in the chat, and I will probably alternate between the two. I think I can set them both up on my screen so I can see them both at once, which is an interesting problem itself. And I'll try to go back and forth here. So starting over with the Q&A, Shidan says, the feast stats are excellent, but has there been thought to study devotional gatherings instead of feasts for worship, since those would be most analogous to Sunday worship for us? There are good stats on those too. Many don't attend feasts, but attend vibrant community building endeavors like devotionals.
That's a great question. I think you're right. In some ways, devotionals are becoming. I know the community I'm in suburban Houston has a weekly devotional service, which would be maybe more comparable to a weekly church service or a weekly synagogue service or something like that. And you're right. We have pretty good data about how many Baha'i communities have devotionals. I'll have to look back and to see if we have data about attendance at devotionals. We probably have that, and I'd have to run some numbers to look for it. We used feast because that's the main worship activity in the Baha'i community, although it has always been difficult when I work with my fact counterpart members, researchers, to explain, well, feasts are not once a week, they're once every 19 days because of this unique calendar. So I know that the people at Hartford Seminary who kind of compile all this data always are not sure what to do with Baha'i once every 19 days kinds of things. But I think you're right that devotionals are becoming a proxy maybe for worship in the Baha'i community. And so maybe we can give more attention to that as we go along.
I know here in my area, we have probably about the same number of people attending weekly devotionals as attending feast. But one of the complicating factors is that the people attending the weekly devotionals are from multiple communities. And so
Right.
Then it's very hard to try and figure out how you would sort that data in a fact kind of context.
Right. Yeah.
Chehre says, were there any surveys of community gardening endeavors, which is a very interesting question.
That is, I don't think so. I don't. Maybe some people wrote gardening in other activities that the community was engaged in, but we could add that to the next fact survey. But I don't think we have any data on that.
Yeah, I don't think it was not a specific question in the fact survey that I remember.
No.
Shidan also asks, is there a sense of what the percentage of participation in feast is? 17 out of how many?
Yeah, 17 out of questions have been asked about regularly participating adults, and the more recently, regularly participating adults could be non-Baha'is. So it's not just the Baha'i memberships, who's on the Baha'i rolls and what percentage of them attend feast, because now regular participants can include non-Baha'is. I know at our devotional, we frequently have non-Baha'is attending who, I guess they could attend feast now, but for a long time, feasts were not open to non-Baha'is. So if I remember right, from regularly participating adults, 17 is about half, or a little over half, of the people on the membership rolls.
The average community size.
Right.
Yeah, and of course, as I understand it, non-Baha'i participation in feast would mean there would be no community business.
Right.
When that happens too, which is also often a difficulty. Another question that has been asked here, also by Shidan, do the multiracial communities consist mainly of white and Persian believers? Where did you put Persian? Under Asian or under white?
Under white.
So Asian meant other than Persian, from like Chinese, Japanese,
right.
South Indian,
yeah,
South Asian and such.
So FACT decided to use the categories that the U.S. Census uses. And so for the U.S. Census calls most Middle Easterners white. Now, we could have a debate about whether that's good or bad, but when we would ask the question, we would ask separately about Persian membership, but that always was subsumed under white.
When it was submitted to FACT anyway.
Yeah,
because that was essential for our data to be comparable to their data.
Right.
Another person, Chehre, asks, are there youth who are not yet Baha'is taking into account in any of these data? Like, I guess, participation in junior youth and youth activities.
They would be if they're participating in junior youth or youth activities. Yeah, they would be counted. Yeah.
Let's see. Gary asked, he noted that besides Ruhi, he'd read that the World Center documents are stressing the importance of social discourse and social action in addition to the core activities. And was there any effort to capture information about them in this survey?
No, that's a great question. And we haven't asked anything about social discourse activities. We could certainly think about doing that for the next FACT iteration, but those weren't asked about specifically.
Those social actions, certainly most of those questions about involvement in the various activities that communities could be involved in, like, what's the word I want? Well, contributing food to food banks and things like that, which
right.
that would all fall under social action, certainly.
Right.
Though it's hard to see how a local Baha'i community would involve itself in local public discourse unless they're involved in interfaith activities, perhaps.
Yeah.
That might be an example.
Or maybe a race unity discussion groups or something like that. I do have some data from earlier surveys about race unity activities or race unity discussion, and Baha'i participation was pretty high, 30 or 40% back in 2010.
Well, going back and forth here, Frank says, your data indicates about 30% of Baha'is are born into the religion. Compared to other religious communities, especially churches, which are said to have declining populations even in the US, and even more so in Europe, how do the Baha'is appear to be doing? If we subtract the number of deaths of various religious communities from the number of new converts, or the number of births to parents of the community, what projections can be made about the future growth of the Baha'is relative to other religious communities? He likes to ask good questions.
Yeah, that is a good question. I know Rob and I have talked about this at various times. You had said there's about a 2% growth rate in the Baha'i faith, if I remember right.
Currently, based on the data the National Assembly has, it's about 1/2%. Actually,
Okay.
annually, it's about 1/2%.
Right.
Maybe less.
Right.
Probably about a half. Yeah, something like that.
Yeah. Yeah. So that's a great question. Again, I think Baha'is, if I understand, more recently, Baha'is have just assumed that once you turn 15, you are a Baha'i without having to declare officially or write a letter or anything like that. So I think Baha'i youth are considered Baha'is unless some action is taken. But in terms of my sense, and I would love to do a study on this actually, Persian youth are more likely to stay active in the Baha'i faith than are Anglo youth. I don't have any data on that, but just kind of my observation in the couple Baha'i communities I've lived in. So I think Persians have done a better job, maybe you could say, of keeping their kids in the faith. And so that's why I think there's been an effort to focus on youth and junior youth. But that's true across the board. I think society at large has been had a detrimental effect on religious participation in general.
Yeah, even the Southern Baptists are now shrinking in size, if I recall. Some groups which are heavily based with immigration, like, for example, Muslims, Latin American Christian groups are growing, mostly because of immigration.
Right.
I remember the Catholics are about 1/4 of the population of the United States.
Yes.
And there's something like 10% of the population of the United States that's former Catholic. But then there's 10% of the population which has come in since that's Latino. And so the Catholic population is held steady.
Right.
Because of Latin American immigration.
Right.
But I think the Presbyterians are down to, and the Methodists are down to about 2/3 their numbers from 30 years ago anyway.
Yeah. So you're absolutely right that what we call the mainline Christian groups, like the Lutherans, the Presbyterians, the Methodists, they have seen 50% or more decline in numbers in the last 20 years. The Catholic Church has remained fairly steady, but that's because of immigration. Even as Rob said, even Southern Baptists, which were very good at keeping their kids, and Mormons are starting to have trouble keeping kids into adulthood. So it's a widespread societal problem.
Yeah, the Mormons are even creating special congregations of unmarried young people. And then as soon as they get married, they have to go to another congregation. So they're creating special just for the young people who aren't married.
Right.
They hang out together.
Right.
So I understand in places where there are enough LDS to do that anyway.
Right.
Really very interesting. And in that sense, the fact that we're growing even 1/2 of 1% per year, even if we're upset with that, it's still a lot better than just about everyone else in the country, I'm afraid. Bill notes, I have noticed a steady downturn in feast attendance as the pandemic has gone on. The need to hold feast virtually is running up against the fact that children, teens, and adults are all spending large parts of their day online in virtual classes or working virtually. Do you have any feedback yet on this? I would venture that people are simply becoming oversaturated with Zoom and other kinds of online meetings.
Yeah, that's a great question. And because we collected all the 2020 data before the pandemic really hit, I don't know anything about that. I have heard anecdotally both things, that people are Zoomed out. And so they don't want to spend all day on Zoom and then also attend feast in the evening on Zoom. But then I've also, in many communities, I've heard that since it's easier to attend, you don't have to get dressed up, you don't have to drive to somebody's house. Actually, attendance has been pretty strong or even up a little bit. So I don't know if the National Assembly has collected any data about Zoom attendance or anything like that. Maybe it'd be fun to get permission from the National Assembly to collect some data about how have communities done with Zoom feasts and Zoom devotionals this past year.
One bit of data that has been announced is that the number of community of interest involved in Baha'i things has gone up. And I heard recently that it's now up to 75,000. Now that's the kind of data that's being collected, of course, in each cluster and reported. And all that data, I assume, most all of it would be Zoom data. So my guess is that according to that data anyway, Zoom may have increased the involvement of the community of interest in Baha'i things. I can say in my area, where I live in a community with 23 adults, and it's the largest community in the area, and we typically only had 5 or 6 people at feast. We're now getting 6 or 7 at Zoom feasts.
Right.
And our devotionals, it's just much easier to go on Zoom than it is to go to the Baha'i Center. So certainly Zoom has been good for us. And I think I also heard that churches initially had a big increase in Zoom participation because of Zoom, and then it dropped off. And then they had the interesting problem that instead of going to their local Methodist church by Zoom, they suddenly heard that a Methodist church 50 miles away had a much better sermon, and people were Zooming there instead. So people were no longer Zooming to their local churches, but to some other church somewhere else.
Right.
And of course, that causes a huge problem of building community.
Yeah.
Let's see. That question was asked. David says, do we know from the religious background or no background of where new Baha'is are coming from? Do we know whether they're of no background or they're from a particular religious background? I don't think there's any data about that.
The FACT survey doesn't ask about converts or anything like that. That's a great question. I'm not sure. Just to piggyback off what Rob said earlier, it will be interesting, assuming that the pandemic comes to a conclusion and that people get vaccinated and so forth this next year. Will people go back to face-to-face worship primarily, or will there be some mixture of face-to-face and continued Zoom meetings, or will feast be face-to-face, but we'll continue to have LSA meetings via Zoom? I've got a LSA meeting tonight on Zoom, and I must say LSA participation has been much higher. We almost always have all 9 people involved now with Zoom. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of mix ends up after this is all over.
It certainly made childcare easier.
Right.
Zoom assembly meetings.
Yeah.
And our feast is tonight by Zoom, come to think of it, but our assembly meeting was last Sunday on Zoom. So
okay.
One of the things I've noticed too is quite interesting. It's sort of parallel to this whole thing about people going to the Methodist service 50 miles away on Zoom, is that, there's firesides in London, England, people can now attend on Zoom. There's a whole very interesting series of deepenings going on in Montreal.
Yeah.
There's a very interesting series of regular firesides in Clearwater, Florida. There have been devotionals in suburban Maryland that I've heard about.
Yeah.
have been very interesting talks about race unity coming out of San Diego. And these are things that sometimes have hundreds or thousands of participants.
Yeah.
That's something that just never could have happened
Right.
In the past.
The Austin, Texas Assembly is hosting a monthly fireside deepening, and Rainn Wilson, the actor, has been involved, and John Hatcher was the speaker last month. And so I don't know how many people attend, but there's people all over the world.
Yep.
When you listen to the questions. So there's been some unique opportunities to do those things as a result.
Yeah, we have someone from Japan regularly in our devotions. And one of our local Baha'is, who's an Arabic speaker, was tutoring a Ruhi book for people in the Gulf states over Zoom,
Right.
These are the kinds of amazing things that have happened as a result of the pandemic, really.
Right.
Jackie says, were there any efforts to find out how people were retained in their communities, especially people of color? Many Baha'i webinars I've been have been many reports of Black people entering the faith and then leaving, or even longtime deepened Black Baha'is have left their communities, but not the faith because of lack of racial sensitivity, feeling invisible, being hurt by actions and speech of other Baha'is. Many report that they don't go to their LSAs about it, so perhaps this is unknown to white members of the communities and LSAs.
I have heard similar things. The fact survey doesn't have any data on that. We do have some data about how many Baha'i communities participate in Martin Luther King celebrations, or have race unity celebrations, or race unity deepenings. But in terms of the connection of African American Baha'is to the community, and I don't know any data that exists about that. That's a good question.
Yeah, Jackie goes on to note that the question came up frequently in the Wilmette Institute course, Anti-Black Racism in the United States. And my impression, which is, I think Jackie's raised a very interesting question here, is that one of the things Zoom has allowed African American Baha'is to do is to meet together cross-community in ways that was not possible before.
Right.
So this has also helped sensitize people about common problems that they had, some of which they often knew anyway. But certainly, I think it has made people more aware, and the Black Lives Matter controversies in the United States and the crackdown by the police and such have also made the white Baha'is much more sensitive about race unity. So in that sense, I think there has been a great increase in interest in the Baha'i community in the last year about the topic. And I think that's, like I said, I think it's also made people more sensitive about how they have been mistreated and more concerned to speak up about it, which of course is also a good thing.
Right.
Some of these questions I'm skipping through because they're, I think, already answered. Khayla says 53% white membership seems high considering our level of Persian membership. Do you know if the Persians are responding to your survey as being white? Well, we answered that because this was just the way the fact people needed the data to be packaged for them. And of course, all this data is being collected primarily by the Assembly Secretary.
Right.
That's the other thing to remember.
So there was a separate space to fill in how many Anglo participants, and then of those, how many are Persian. So I didn't separate that out in what I presented here, but included in that are Persian believers.
A lot of small communities do not have very many Iranian Americans. There are quite a few, obviously, in certain parts of the country.
Right.
But like in my area with close to 100 Baha'is, we've probably got 5 Persian. Oh, 6 or 7 maybe.
Yeah.
We don't have a huge number. Dwayne says, I've not heard of this survey before, which surprises me. I regularly pray with the Topeka Quaker group, and until COVID attended Quran classes at the local mosque, and I've been president of the Interfaith of Topeka. How has this survey and this information been sent to those groups in Topeka?
Well, that's a good question, Dwayne. I think I know who that Dwayne in Topeka is. Hi, Dwayne. The challenge that we found is that you've got some people who participate, in fact, are more researchers, which is kind of what I am, and then some are more what we call key communicators. And early on in the FACT survey, there was a lot more emphasis, and they had grant money to have key communicators take all the FACT data for each faith tradition and get that out to the community, whether that's to priests or pastors or imams or community leaders or whoever. And we have ongoing debates when the FACT research group meets about how do we get this into the hands of people who could use this data. So I'm sorry if folks in Topeka or lots of other places haven't heard of this before. Rob and I have talked about frequently about how we can get this out and how can it be useful. But all of the participants of the FACT survey are asking the same question.
And some of the questions, in fact, that Jackie raised about the participation of African Americans has been a big issue for the FACT people as well. African American denominations often do not have, for example, an email list of all their congregations. Many white denominations have a research department that does surveying. African American denominations often don't have that. So there has been a real problem getting the survey data, the surveys themselves, in the hands of key communicators in African American churches. And that's been a problem since the year 2000. And they've been working on it all kinds of different ways. They've been going to seminaries and trying to get seminaries where there are African American researchers involved. And it's been a very difficult problem.
In early years, they did phone interviews with African American pastors to try, because a lot of them have two careers. They are a pastor on Sunday morning, but then they have another job during the week, so they're not in the office, so to speak, the church office throughout the week. So it's Muslims trying to get a hold of Muslim leaders has also been difficult, sometimes because of a language barrier, sometimes because of distrust of filling out surveys. So there's many challenges in terms of getting to the non-white Christian population.
Yeah. God bless Ehsan Bagby for all the work he's been doing to count the Muslims.
Absolutely.
Really, really been doing an amazing amount of work.
Yeah.
And Alexei Krindach with the work he's been doing trying to collect data from the Eastern Orthodox. And he has all kinds of interesting problems. He'll call up a Serbian Orthodox church and explain what he's doing, and they'll say, "You're Russian? And you're working for the Greeks? Why do the Greeks want to know how many Serbian Orthodox there are?" And these kinds of problems, makes it very difficult to collect the data.
Right.
So,
and as you saw,
we're very lucky. We've got it all on a computer.
Right. And as you saw, 99% of Baha'i communities have an email address. And so they're, for this kind of surveying, it's fairly easy to contact people.
Nathan says, are there any religious communities seeing steady growth? If so, are they doing something notably different?
That's a good question. I think that's becoming less and less often that's happening. As Rob said earlier, if there have been increases in the Catholic Church, it's because of immigration, and not just from Mexico and Central America and so forth, but also Filipino Catholics or Vietnamese Catholics immigrating to the United States. So the Catholic Church is growing a little bit in some pockets. Most mainline churches are declining. Again, the evangelical Christians or more conservative Christians are continuing to grow a little bit, but their rate of growth has slowed dramatically. So some predict that within another 10 years, they will also start to see declines in participation, unless something changes or unless something dramatic happens. But so no, I don't think any group is seeing sustained dramatic growth.
Kayla asks another very interesting question. The Baha'is communities are partitioned by boundaries, city boundaries. With our history of racial segregation in America, do you think this partitioning scheme is contributing to racial segregation in our communities?
That's a good question. I think it probably is to some degree. I know that when I first was a Baha'i, I lived in Atlanta, and there are lots of African-American Baha'is in Atlanta, the city of Atlanta itself, but you get out to some of the suburbs and they're almost all white Baha'i communities. And I heard many, I remember a meeting, this just as anecdotal, but I remember one unity meeting that we had at the Atlanta Baha'i Center downtown in the middle of the historic Black community. And I went there every week for a deepening, but I heard several white Baha'is say, "I've never been down here." And I was just kind of struck that, the quote main Baha'i Center of Atlanta, and there was a lot of white Baha'is from the suburbs who had never been there. So I think, housing segregation follows, school segregation follows, and since Baha'is are organized by municipal boundaries, then some of our segregation is a result of that. Yeah.
Let me see. Questions and comments are still pouring in here. Shall we turn off the screen sharing? One person.
Okay, sure.
So why don't you do that? Let me see. I'm not sure what that question is. Has the racial and ethnic distribution of our community, what is it? Was there a way to measure it in either 2010 or 2020 of the community?
The racial
and
diversity
distribution of our community. In other words, I guess the diversity.
I'm trying to remember.
It's not something FACT actually collects, it seems to me.
No, it's not. What the key informant or the LSA secretary would report is what percentage of your community is Hispanic or African American or Anglo, etc. If I remember right, we were around 20% African American, so we were above the national average. But again, that 53% that I reported earlier, that is the number of communities that are multiracial. So they have not just African Americans, but maybe Hispanic or other kinds of diversity, so that there's a significant, or 20% at least, of that community is non-majority.
Jill asks, what percentage of other faith traditions are born in that faith tradition? Do we have any of that data?
Yeah, that's a good question. What percentage of other faith traditions have people born into that?
Yeah, like for example, if 30% of the Baha'is are born as Baha'is, what percentage of Methodists are born Methodist?
Yeah.
Of course, even if it's 50% born Methodist, it might still be 80 or 90% born Protestant.
Yes, right. So back in the 1950s, what we in sociology of religion call switching, people who switch denominations, it was only about 10 or 15%. So if you were born a Methodist, you stayed a Methodist. The most recent data I saw was that among Protestants, 40%, almost 50% have switched. So if you were born a Methodist, you might switch to Presbyterian or something like that. So about half of Protestants switch, usually within Protestantism, though. Among Catholics, it's much less. Catholics are much more likely to stay within their Catholic tradition. It's only about 20% of Catholics switch into something other than into some other Christian church. So I don't know if that answers the question, but there's a lot more switching, as we call it. But actually, the largest group of switchers are now people who switch out of religion completely. So they just drop out. So the fastest growing group of religious folks in the United States are people with no religion, people who don't claim any affiliation. And that's mostly millennials again.
Yeah. Per J, I think this is per J. Let me check. Well, no, just some person asked, do we have any numbers of Baha'is in the United States? People say there has been a decline in the U.S.
In the number of Baha'is?
Yeah.
Well, Rob maybe knows this National Spiritual Assembly data than I do, but I think there's been attempts to kind of clean up the membership rolls, and to, if you eliminate Baha'is who are not active or never were fully participating, I think that reduces our numbers. But that's true of any church or synagogue or mosque. If you try to clean the rolls, so to speak, to get no-shows off the rolls, you're going to see a decline.
Yeah. The raw numbers, I mean, the National Spiritual Assembly publishes an annual report every year, so people might want to go look at the annual report. It's generally somewhere around page 10, 12, 13, 14, right in there, and near the beginning of the annual report. And Resvan 2019, they report 176,000 people, Baha'is, living Baha'is in the database. In Resvan 2020, a year later, it was 177,000, so it had gone up by 1,000. And they report the number of people with good addresses, and the number of people with good address has been more or less constant. I can't remember whether it's like 75,000, 79,000. So it's somewhere around 40% of all the Baha'is in the U.S. for whom we have good addresses. People might feel that's awfully low, but if you were to try and ask every Catholic in the United States to provide their address to a central Catholic authority, how much would you get? 5%, 2%? It's very hard for communities to keep that data. The Mormons try, and the Seventh-day Adventists try. And I think even the Mormons probably have difficulty keeping their membership data really up to date that way. Overseas, like in some countries like in Argentina and Bolivia, the number of people the Mormon church says are Mormons in those countries is something like half or two-thirds the number of people who report being Mormon to the official government census, which means people may have become Mormon and then they left the Mormon church, but of course they never told the Mormon church because they kind of drifted out. So every religious community has this issue. And you can often, I think you can talk about concentric circles of Baha'i community activity depending on what you want to measure. You can't say, well, what is an active Baha'i versus a non-active Baha'i, because you have to decide, well, what activity do you want to look? Are they praying? Well, you have no idea whether they're praying. So these are very complicated issues to try and nail down.
Right.
Perjea says, thank you for your presentation. How may we access the full report?
Good question. I'm in the process of working on a full report because I'll report to the National Spiritual Assembly, who gives permission for us to collect this data. So once that's available, or once that's finished and I send it to the National Assembly, then I presume it could be made available somehow, or I don't know, Rob, if you want to make the PowerPoint available to folks or how that works. But
I think we already have put it up actually on the website for your talk.
Very good.
So people can click through. I think Nikki already uploaded it today.
Okay.
So it's there. We still have 24 messages, and I don't know how much longer we can go on here because there's just so many comments that people are making that are very interesting. Let me see. I think that's one we answered already. The survey, the racial and ethnic distribution of our own community in 2010 and 2020. One thing I can say about that, based on the National Assembly's database, is that we only have ethnicity data for 60 or 70,000 out of the 177,000 Baha'is. The others were never asked. So it's very tricky to say such and such a percentage of the community is this or that. We can say based on the 60 or 70,000 people for whom the question has been asked and they've answered it, but it's very hard to give a larger number. One person notes in their area in mid-Hudson, New York, Zoom has enabled a great increase in participation. In Europe, many Zoom meetings involve participants from a number of different countries. We mentioned that. Race unity efforts are also seeing expansion due to the convenience of Zoom. I think that's very true. Zoom and the Nextdoor application have also increased dialogue along race in one neighborhood that I know of. People are using Nextdoor to talk to their neighbors about, do significant conversation with neighbors.
Right. I know that, just again, based on some anecdotal things I've heard, when we had the twin birthday celebrations in 2017 and 2019, right, for the Bab and Baha'u'llah, I know our community and many communities in the Houston area where I live intentionally built race unity aspects into those public presentations. And I know that many assemblies have already talked about doing the same thing when we get ready for celebrating the centenary of Abdu'l-Baha's passing, since his trip to the United States was so important in mirroring Baha'i racial unity activity. So I think there's been opportunities recently to increase that. And with Abdu'l-Baha's centenary coming up, that'll be another opportunity.
Just today, I received an email from the Baha'i World News Service that Richard Thomas's paper about the history of the involvement of the Baha'i faith in racial justice in the United States is now available. I think it's at the Baha'i World website, and I looked at it. It's an excellent article. So that's another resource that people all have. I mean, going farther down, because some of the Q&A ones are also in the chat. One person notes the National Assembly doesn't, quote, clean the rolls to remove people who are not participating. We can only remove people who have requested to be removed. There are people whose addresses aren't known, and these people remain on our membership rolls as a mail return. And that, of course, is very true. And in fact, one of the things the Mormons do is if they have someone who's a mail return, they consider them a member until the person is 120 years old, and then they drop them from the list, apparently. We probably going to have to think about what we're going to do about that, because no doubt some of the people who are mail returns die, and we can't obviously be leaving them on the rolls in the year 2100. But I don't know if the National Assembly has yet tried to figure out what policy. Like I said, the Mormon policy is if they have a birth date for the person, once the person turns 120, they drop them, which is certainly one way of doing it.
Yeah,
we actually have hit the bottom of all the questions.
Okay,
I'm glad to say.
Let me make a point, because several people have asked about racial composition and so forth. Those are great questions, and I wish we had the data on that. The fact data do not survey individuals, however, so we didn't ask what is your race or ethnicity, or we were asking key informants about what is the diversity within your community. So they were reporting kind of aggregate level data, so we don't have individual level data. And as Rob said, that we only about half of our roles have that kind of information anyway. But those are great questions. I can pretty confidently say, based on the fact data, that we have a significant number of multiracial congregations in our Baha'i community, much higher than the average religious community. But what percentage are African American or Hispanic or something like that? The data don't have that information, unfortunately. So, but those are good questions.
Yep. And good questions to think about for future surveys.
Absolutely.
And so on that note, I want to thank you again, Mike. This is a fascinating presentation.
My pleasure.
Lots of good questions. I'm glad we were able to get this data out to the Baha'i community in this way. I think people will really enjoy and appreciate the result of this particular survey.
I hope so.
Well, the value of answering these questions, because a lot of assembly secretaries find it very inconvenient filling out those surveys. My wife is complaining, it's 45 minutes. But you can see the value of doing it, because we need to be able to collect this kind of information in order to be able to get a sense of not only where the Baha'i community is at today, but how it does compare to other communities.
Right.
And there are certain areas where clearly we're not as active as other communities, partly because we're smaller. You know,
exactly.
A typical community of 17 people going to feast is not in a position to open its own soup kitchen. So obviously we're not able to do some of those kinds of social services. But what we do, I think, is quite impressive considering our size as well.
Especially in terms of education, spiritual meetings, spiritual gatherings, and interfaith work. We are far more active in those things than most religious groups.
Very good. Well, thank you again. Thank you to our audience
thank you all for participating.
For asking so many good questions. And a reminder, we have another webinar next week, which is a philosophical topic about the death and resurrection of God. And then the week after that, we have a panel discussion. And we hope that you will be able to join us for those particular programs as well. So I will now sign off and wish everyone a good day, and we look forward to seeing you again. Thanks for joining us.